Okay, this is part 5 of the series of Shirim, with the intention of comprehensively covering the basic sources, the Chazalic sources, have to do with Tzitzit, with a view to having a complete picture, which allows us to answer a lot of questions that are quite controversial among Makoriist, broadly conceived people, about how to wear Tzitzit, what kind of garments, etc. Okay, and we are now holding at Sifrei Devarim. Sifrei Devarim, I am using the edition of Louis Finkelstein, Professor Louis Finkelstein, which was based upon the work of Chaim Shmuel Horowitz, who we're learning from his edition of the Sifrei on Bamidbar. And he originally wanted to do an edition on Sifrei, Bamidbar, and Devarim, which traditionally were packaged together as one book, even though they are very certainly not one book. But he didn't finish, and many decades later, Louis Finkelstein built on his work and produced an edition of Sifrei Devarim. Louis Finkelstein is he's quite an influential figure in Jewish studies. He's a kind of leader of the sort of was the leader of the sort of what you might call the conservadox school of Jewish studies, and a lot of ideas that are in the ether that a lot of what we might call thrum but with it people believe, they came from Louis Finkelstein. So, for example, if you believe that the Haggadah has all sorts of polemical messages which have to do with politics, various politics, imperial politics during the Second Temple period, that's something that came from Louis Finkelstein. Similarly, if you believe that kind of Chazal are the sort of the kind of ideological inheritors of the traditions of the Pharisees, the Perushim in particular, and they kind of won because they were the only ones who had the sort of version of Judaism that could survive without a Beit Mikdash. That's also an idea that was elucidated by Louis Finkelstein, and many other ideas too. And some of them are demonstrably false. Some of them are still kind of a topic of controversy. Anyway, Sifrei Devarim is, as we mentioned, from the school of Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. So in that way, it's similar to Sifra, and also similar to Sifrei Zuta on Bamidbar that we looked at. Unlike Sifra and like Sifrei Zuta, it is relatively brief. And because we're only going to look at one pasuk, because there's only one pasuk in Sefer Devarim on the subject of Tzitzit, I also thought it'd be apropos to do the Sifrei on the preceding pasuk that talks about shatnez. Because as we're going to see, the issue of shatnez and Tzitzit are closely connected, and B, a number of the comments that the Sifrei has to say on shatnez illuminate kind of by certain things about Tzitzit. All right, so we're starting. It's the source sheet's linked to in the description. Scroll down a bit. It's Sifrei on Perek Kaf Bet, pasuk Yud Aleph. We're starting. Lo thilbash shatnez. You shouldn't wear shatnez. Yachol lo yilbash gizesem wa'anise pishtan. Maybe it means you can't take kind of unworked wool, shaved from a sheep, and chips of flax, and sort of somehow make some sort of garment out of them, and that would be shatnez. Tambalama shatnez. The word shatnez. Davar sheshua barui wenuz. Shatnez has the letters shin and ayin, then the letter tet, and then the letter nun zayin. And the drasha on that is it has to be something that's shua, tavui, nuz. Now, what are these three things? Tavui is that's the easiest one, the middle one. Tavui is spinning. So you have these hairs of wool or very thin fibers of linen. And before you can start weaving them, you have to kind of make them in something somewhat thicker. So you take multiples of these and you spin them together. That's tavui. Shua and nuz are much harder. Shua means to do something to do with smoothing. And nuz is generally taken to be a synonym for weaving. Now, this is many of the comments we're going to see here in the Sifrei are very similar to Mishnayot in the last perek of Masechet Kilayim. And those who know that perek will know that this is a massive Machlokes Rishonim, what exactly it means. Some, like Rashi, hold that it's actually very hard to make something that's actually shatnez. You have to take wool and linen and then kind of card them together, then spin them together, then weave them together. And otherwise, it may well be asad derabanan, but it's not biblical shatnez. Whereas the Rambam holds that essentially sufficient to do any one of these activities with wool and linen together. And that one activity doing together would make it shatnez. As we're going to see from certain things, the Bavli is going to say about, not just the Bavli, also the Sifrei is going to say about the relationship with shatnez and tzitzit. It's not 100% clear even that necessarily is necessary. What it comes to tell you is that to be shatnez, something it can't be raw wool and raw linen. That's what the Sifrei is telling you. It has to be processed into some kind of proper garment. But it doesn't necessarily tell you at what point the wool and obviously at some point wool and linen has to be connected together, otherwise they're not connected, otherwise they're not shatnez. It doesn't never necessarily tell you that it has to be connected through one of these three processes. It just tells you that these three processes, or at least one of these three processes, need to happen in order for it to be considered a beged that's Hive and Tzitzit. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, this is also the Mishnah, Neloz u'melis u'eth aviv sheba shamayim Allah. There's a different kind of drasha on the word shatnez, which obviously is like an unusual word that we can't really, doesn't have a clearly identifiable shoresh or anything like that. But he relates it to the word, the shoresh lahaliz, which means to be considered despicable, something like that. So the point is, someone who wears shatnez, he's disgusting and he makes his Father in heaven hated. You shouldn't wear shatnez. Okay. Lo thilbash. Something here quite important. Enli ela shelo yobash. The Torah says you shouldn't wear, so I might think it means you only the mitzvah shatnez. The Isra shatnez only applies to someone who wears. Minayin shelo yithkaseh. How do we know that you also can't cover yourself with shatnez? Which tells you what? That Lehit Kasot is not considered by Chazal, in their terminology, to be a subset of wearing. So if the Torah merely told you you're not allowed to wear, then you wouldn't know it was asked to cover yourself with. Therefore, so what? Therefore, when I make the argument that a Kasut Laila, according to Chazal, is a bedspread, basically, and therefore when Chazal tell you that Kasut Laila is part from Tzitzit, they're not referring to some imaginary pajamas that never actually existed. They're just referring to a very common item, which is a rectangular bedspread. People say, well, it can't be because that's obvious that wouldn't be Hive and Tzitzit, because Tzitzit is something you wear. How do we know Tzitzit is something you wear? Because in Bamidbar, in Parshat Shalach Lecha, it talks about bigdeihem, their clothes, and you wear clothes. But actually, the Torah in neither here or in Bamidbar talks about wearing a garment with tzitzit. And what it does say is asher tekaseva, you should cover yourself with. And covering is not the same thing as wearing. The Sifrei continues, how do we know that you're not allowed to cover yourself with kalayim? Tamaloma lo ya'ale alecha. The pasuk in Vayikra in Parshat Kedoshim that also talks about the Isra of kalayim, and issue of shatnez. Doesn't use the word shatnez. It does use the word shatnez, sorry. It also talks about the issue of kalayim, and but it ties it juxtaposes it there to the other isurim of kalayim, that is to say, kalayim of sowing of the field and kalayim of animals. It says lo ya'alecha, lo ya'ale alecha. Lo ya'ale alecha includes not just things you wear, but something you kind of wrap yourself up with. You wouldn't call it wearing. It's not really the normal way of wearing clothes, but it is covering. And that is also asa mishum kalayim. Well, if it's already asa to kind of have a sheet on top of you, even if you're not really wearing it, maybe it's also asa to drag some kilayim in a basket on the floor behind you. Tamalama lo thilbash. Well, that's why it says lo thilbash. Levisha bichlal hayatha walama yatsaf lahakish aleha walama lacha ma levisha miyuchedeth shehi haniyat thaguf. So you have a pasuk here in Devarim that says lo thilbash. You have a pasuk in Vayikra that says lo ya'ale alecha, which comes to extend the concept of lo thilbash, but not infinitely. And the answer is, just as wearing is something that has some benefit to your body, it heats you up, keeps you warm, protects you from the elements. So to be over the Isser of Shatnez, you have to, with this garment that mixes wool and linen in an improper way, you have to have hanaya thaguf. You have to be keeping you warm, protecting you from the elements in some way. Okay, it continues. Yachtav. The pasuk continues. Yachtav. Yachol lo yelbash chaluk shel seme al gabe chaluk shel pishtan. V'chaluk shel pishtan al gabe chaluk shel seme tamoloma yachtav. What does the word yachtav in this thing? Lo tebash shatnez. Seme ufishtim yachtav. What does it tell you? It tells you that they have to be together. So it's perfectly permissible for me to wear a linen shirt, which is cotton, a linen shirt, and a woolen vest, or vice versa, or a jumper. That's perfectly fine. The mere contact is not a problem. They have to be together in some way. Not necessarily, as we see that the way the Sifrei presents it, at least, to return to this Machlokes Rishonim, it's not that they have to be together in a sense that they have to fulfill one of those things, shua to the nuz. That is what defines them as being as a garment. They merely have to be yachtav, and two separate articles of clothing are not yachtav. Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel omer minayin shelo yikshor seret shel seme b'shel fishtan lachbor bo eth matna afal pi sheharasua be'emsa. This again is a mission, or very closely related to a mission. And again, by the way, just I mentioned this in previous shiurim, but it's important to be aware that while the Sifrei and all the halachic midrashim include material from different time periods, it's almost certainly the case that the editing of the Sifrei, the compilation of it, was quite some time, 100 years or so after the compilation of the Mishnah. And therefore, when you have a relationship between the Mishnah and the Sifrei, it's usually more correct to say the Sifrei is riffing off the Mishnah and the Mishnah is riffing off the Sifrei. Anyway, this Mishnah or this Sifrei says, how do you know? You have a kind of belt type affair, and you've got a piece of leather, and you have a woolen kind of wool attached to it here, and linen attached to it here. So the wool and linen are not directly tied up. How do you know it's still asa to tie yourself up with it? Tamalama yachtav, together. B'kol and they are together. That previous thing about the strap, that also is a big Machlokes Rishonim. Some hold that it's a problem. The reason it's a problem is because when you tie it up, now the wool and the linen are together, and therefore that's more easy to understand. Some hold no, even if there's kind of two other straps, there's leather, wool on this side, linen on this side, and then another piece of leather in the middle, and the wool and linen never touch. Nevertheless, it's a problem. This is really not kind of negate to our topic, so we won't go into it. And then the second part, kashatimsa omer hasakwa kupa, the sack and the basket or like a sack literally means like a sack, combine the kilayim. Again, what that means is a big ma'achot rishonim. I'm not going to go into it. Not going to go into it now. Kilayim is actually another subject that would be very appropriate for a kind of series of shiurim like this, from beginning to end, to like look at all the sources. Sema ufishim yachtav. Aval ze b'fnei asma wa ze b'fnei asma mutar. Obviously, it seems to be quite obvious, that comment. Linen by itself and pishtan by itself is okay. Halavadin asurim mishum kilayim afal pi she'en behem mishum arig yesh behem mishum shu'ama. Levadim, which are felted kind of pieces of fabric, which, if you look at felt, you'll see it's kind of all, it's not woven. You can't see lines like this. The fibers are all over the place, and for a certain process with steam, etc., you can nevertheless make, a kind of garment out, a kind of material, a kind of a textile out of it. And even though they've never been woven, says the Sifrei, and also says the Mishnah, it's still kilayim. Most Rishonim hold, based upon that same Mishnah, which says, a previous Mishnah, which says pretty explicitly, it can't be shatnez unless it's been spun and woven. This means it's kilayim d'Rabbanan. Not everyone holds that way, though, and again, that's for sure about kilayim. The Sifrei continues with something now directly relevant, which now addresses the juxtaposition. Why the pasuk about kilayim immediately precedes the pasuk about shatnez. Why the pasuk about shatnez immediately precedes the pasuk about tzitzit. So lo filba shatnez, and then it says gedilim ta'asa lecha shnehem ne'emru b'dibur echad. Both of these commandments were said in one dibur, in one speech act. Means what? It continues. Zachor v'shamor shnehem ne'emru b'dibur echad. Zachor, the mitzvah of remembering Shabbat, v'shamor, the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat, from the two different versions of the Aseret Debrot. When it returns over them, there are slight variants in wording. One of them is Zachor and v'shamor. Both of them were said in one dibur. Machalaleha mothuma. Those who break the Shabbos will die. But it also says you have to bring a korban musaf. And a korban musaf is what? Well, you have to shecht it. That's already issa skila. Do you have to? If you're going to have to skin it, that's another issa skila. You have to burn it. That's an issa skila. There's a whole many issarim involved in going from the beginning to the end of the process of bringing a korban, and nevertheless the Torah says you to do both, tells you to do both of them. You're not allowed to marry or have relations with your brother's wife, even if they're divorced, even if he's dead, blah blah blah. However, yavama yavo aleha, we have a mitzvah of yibum, which means that under certain conditions, not only is it permissible to marry and then have relations with your brother's wife, or even kind of doraita. We don't do it for various reasons, as a rule, but you're supposed to do it. Both of these were said in one word. And every daughter will inherit the nachala. And this is now referencing the whole the peninsula of Chad, and the different stages when they wanted to inherit, and there are contradictions there again. And nevertheless, now the Sifrei here brings different ones. Something like Zachor and Shamor is obviously not. That is a mitzvah to remember Shabbat, and that is a mitzvah to keep Shabbat. They're not contradictory to each other. They would be contradictory if you were to assume there was one version of the Aseret Debrot, and it was given word for word. That would be contradictory, because obviously there are two versions and they say different things. The other ones are basically examples of things that the Torah, so to speak, contradicts itself, or to put it more precisely, gives exception. It gives a rule, and then it tells you when that rule doesn't apply. And one of those examples is shatnez and gedilim ta'aseh lecha. Tells you what? Gedilim ta'aseh lecha means shatnez. Okay, and why does gedilim ta'aseh lecha mean shatnez? Because tefillin has to be wool, as the Gemara makes clear, and as is in fact a fact. You can more or less you can make tefillin sort of adhere to other substances, but it will wash out relatively quickly. In order to make a proper fast dye that will last a significant amount of time, and it kind of would be nechshav techelet. Techelet is not so much a color. Techelet is a material, and that material is wool dyed with the dye from the Murex trunculus. And nevertheless, you can put it on a linen garment, or rather, if you have a linen garment that's got four corners, you have to put it on. Certainly, that's the way the Sifrei is understanding it. We'll see that's a source of debate in the Gemara. But as the Sifrei is taking it as a given, if you've got a linen garment that's four corners, you have to put tzitzit on it. That means you have to put strings of techelet on it. And that means you have to, the Torah is giving you an exemption from the mitzvah of shatnez. It's not the only one, of course, because many of the garments of the Kohen Gadol and one garment of any Kohen, namely the sash, also have a shatnez in it. But it's the only one that applies to ordinary people like you and me, assuming you're not a Kohen. The Sifrei kind of sums up the whole thing and says, "Ma she'efshar levasa badam lo ma shnei Devarim ka'achath shnema achath be'elokim shtayim zo shaman." We have a pasuk from Tehillim that says, God spoke once and we heard twice. Now, in actually the case of Gedilim Ta'aseh Lecha and Shatnez, it's not such a, I mean, if sort of the state of Israel said, like, you have to keep the speed limit unless it's an emergency, we wouldn't say, oh, wow, that's really like a deep mystical concept that's very hard to understand. Rules can have exceptions. That applies merely more to the Zachor Neshamot example, which is that there's only one Aseret to depart, and it has two gears. And nevertheless, it was said once, but with two gears, which is a kind of mystical and deeper concept to understand. But our topic here is there's a mitzvah of shatnez, and nevertheless, there's a certain situation where you have to not keep shatnez. What is that situation? That situation is when you have a four-corner garment, and you have to put tzitzit on it, if that garment is made of linen. Okay. Now the Sifrei turns to our pasuk. Gedilim ta'aseh lecha. You shall make gedilim. Lama ne'ema, lefi shene'ema wa'asu lehem tzitzit. Because it says over there in Bamidbar, they shall make for themselves tzitzit. Shomer ani, and this recalls what we've seen before. I hear from that. Chut echad b'fnei asmo. You only need one string. That's what I think if it says tzitzit. At least one string per corner. Talmud lomar gedilim. By definition, a gedil, as Godzilla understand it, must be made by tying numerous strings together. How many gedilim should be made? En pachoth mishlosha chutim. No less than 3. That's what Beth Hillel say. Beshamai omarim, and you probably remember this came from Sifrei. And what did the Sifrei say? It said that Beshamai say, no, 3 strings of white and 1 string of blue, and halakha is like Beshamai. However, what does our Sifrei say? What does our Sifrei on Devarim say? Beshamai omarim me arba'a chutim shal techeles wa arba'a chutim shal leva. 4 of techeles and 4 of leva. Now, no one holds you should wear 4 chutim of techelet and 4 chutim of levan. But there is a shita, which is by far and away the majority shita among the Rishonim, which is known colloquially as like Tosfos, because if you go to the shop and they'll say, do you want to buy Rivad, Rambam, or Tosfos? But first of all, loads of Rishonim say it, but Tosfos are not the first Rishon to say it. Rashi says it, and when Tosfos say it, they're literally quoting Rashi. So I don't know why it doesn't say Rashi, but people say Tosfos in any case. We say you should have 2 strings of blue and 2 strings of white. Well, what's that got to do with 4 strings of blue and 4 strings of white? Well, once you put them through the garment and you get 8 strings, 4 of those half strings are white and 4 of those half strings are blue. Okay. So we have two sources from Chazal, one from Sifrei the Midbar, one from Sifrei Devarim, one from Sifrei the Midbar that Lechora supports Rivad, one string of blue, and one supports Shitta of Tosfos, so to speak, that supports two strings of blue. And the entire debate about whether you should do one string of blue or two strings of blue hinges on which of these is the more reliable source. Now, I think probably it's Godai to give a whole shir on this issue. There's a someone from America, I think Lakewood, I don't recall exactly, but someone from America wrote a good kind of contrast/safer kind of thing, where he argued at great length and with great rigor, and did a good job of looking at gears and stuff. This in Sifrei Devarim is this in Sifrei Devarim is more reliable, and you should have two strings of blue. I nevertheless don't agree. I think you should do one string of blue, but this is not the time to go through all the arguments why I think so. I'll just point out one point, which is one of the sources. It's not very plausible that these sources kind of are completely disconnected from each other. If you've got a Machlokas Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about how many strings, it's not very likely there are two completely independent traditions that go all the way back to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. There's a relationship between these two sources, and therefore, basically, one of these sources is unreliable because it's been damaged, so to speak. There's been a kink in the transmission. And so you have to, basically the question hinges on, is the Sifrei the Midbar more reliable and is the Sifrei Devarim more reliable? Now, one of the reasons why, just one, I'll mention here before we move on, one of the reasons I think this one in Sifrei Devarim is less reliable is because there's an internal inconsistency in terminology. Why? Because it says, En pachos mishlosha chutim. You can't use less than three, K'divrei Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai remei arba chutim shel techelet, mi'arba chutim shel levan. Now, when they say arba chutim, either they mean the whole string or they mean half a string. Now, if they are supporting Tosfos shitta, then they must be supporting us. Then when they say four, they mean four half ones. I.e., when they say four, they mean two. But if they say when they say four, they mean two, then it must be the case that when Beit Hillel say three, they mean 1.5. But A, you can't have 1.5 strings. That's not a possible thing to have. And B, no one's ever suggested such a thing. So the transition from calling a whole string a string to calling a half string a string within the same source is a big red flag that something is off. Which, by the way, Louis Finkelstein, interestingly, he just claims, which is kind of his sort of derech, is to claim, oh, it's just a completely different tradition, and there was some kind of halacha keduma where actually they would wear 8 strings on their tzitzit, and he references a Gemara in the Bavli to kind of support that, which we're going to look at in due course, but it doesn't really support that, and that's kind of, but that's very much Louis Finkelstein's approach, which is most kind of scholars in the field nowadays don't really, they regard it as like a mistaken approach, and I don't disagree with them, but it's still kind of quite out there, kind of in the ether, influencing how people think, especially the kind of from the Whittier crowd, as I mentioned, who the idea, if you've got two sources that are very similar, then they kind of represent two traditions, kind of go all the way back to kind of the earliest point you could say the source was talking about. So Louis Finkelstein identifies in this a kind of ancient tradition of wearing 8 strings on your tzitzit, 4 of blue, 4 of white. But I think that's very unlikely. Okay, it continues. These 4 strings shall arba etzbaot. They have to be 4 etzbaot. Now, this again is a machlokus. It appears this exact same requirement of being 4 etzbaot appears in the Gemara, although it's usually quoted in halacha as arba agudalim, and of course an agudal is slightly wider than an etzba. From here, and this is the most reasonable thing, you just assume it meant that the whole string has to be 4 etzba. The whole string from beginning to end has to be, the whole tzitzit has to be 4 etzba long. However, there are Rishonim who hold it has to it refers to the tzitzit, the bits that come out of the gedul, they have to be 4 etzba long, and that's also quite reasonable. And then there's the stricter shitta, which is according to the Rosh, which is the gedil itself has to be 4 etzba long, which is, I don't know, you'd have to kind of work really hard before that kind of the source would like look like that's what it said. But nevertheless, the Shulchan Aruch is posek halacha to be machmir like that, and therefore people will tell you your sits have to be 12 agudalim. Why? Because your gadil has to be 4 esbar long, and you're supposed to have at least a 1-to-2 ratio of gadil to anaf, so that therefore the anaf has to be 8 agudalim long. So therefore the whole thing has to be 12 agudalim long. Which, if you're going by the Shulchan Aruch, yeah, that's I guess what you have to do. I was once stopped in the street by a kindly Sephardi man who informed me that my sits were puzzle, and so I kind of went through what I just kind of told you, and I also could have said, well, even that doesn't actually mean that they're puzzle if they're because we're going to see, that's all these dins of length for lechatchila, but the Eved Kedei Aniva is fine, but he wasn't having it anyway. The halacha is very Beis Shammai. The halacha is like Beis Shammai. That you have to have, according to how we read the source, either 3 of white and 1 of blue, or 2 of blue and 2 of white, or 4 of blue and 4 of white. That's what the halacha is like Beis Shammai. It says, "B'meh devarim amorim betachila aval b'shireha u'v'gadumeha kol shehu." As to lechatchila, when you tie it should be that long. But if things happen, and especially if you've got techelet in your tzitzit, you're not just going to put new tzitzit on every single time a bit of it falls off or something, it snaps or something. Kol shehu, you can have kol shehu. And kol shehu literally means any amount. The Gemara says it's kind of slightly more than kol shehu, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be 4 etzba'ot long. It should be when you tie it, but your sitzah is still kosher even afterwards. Now, I should mention that we've mentioned that there's a source for Ravid's shitta of 1 string of blue, and there's a source for Tosfos's shitta of 2 strings of blue. We haven't mentioned there's a source for Rambam's shitta of half a string of blue because there isn't one. And something that, apart from the fact there's no source of Rambam's shitta, something I found out when I went to one of these tours of the factory that they have, the Patil Techela factory, is that one of the reasons why a Rambam set is not half the price of a Ravid set, which is roughly what you'd expect, given that you're basically paying for the dye, not the strings, is because actually it's very hard for them to make the Rambam strings, because you're not supposed to just take a string and then dye half of it. That's because the middle of it isn't dyed. That's not really dyeing, that's painting. You're supposed to dye the wool and then make it the strings. Well, how do you make a string that's half blue and half white? Well, it's not rocket science. It's not like an undoable thing, but it's a complex process, which ends up costing more. And there's no mention of such a process anywhere in Chazal, and there's no source for saying thinking you should do such a thing. So if you take one thing from Yeshua and don't get a Rambam set. Pay the extra 5 shekel for the Ravid set at least. Okay. Al-Arba. The pasuk continues, Al-Arba Kanfal Kasutcha, and we're now being Doris the words Al-Arba. Yasu ba'ale shlosha, uba'ale chamesh, uba'ale shesh, uba'ale sheva, uba'ale shmona. Arba means Arba. 4 means 4. Not 3, not 5, not 6, not 7, not 8. And that's what we've seen also in the previous in Sifrei Sutta and Sifrei Bamidva, we've seen the same drosha made. 4, it doesn't mean 4 and R, as some Rishonim hold. In the halachic midrash, we only find the opinion that it means davka 4. Dvar ugadilim ta'aseh lecha. Gadilim you shall make for yourself. Ze lavan. This refers to lavan. Okay, I mean that's fairly simple to understand. If you only had this pasuk in Devarim, which says Gedilim ta'aseh arba kanfot kasutcha asher techaseh ba, then you'd think, well, make some Gedilim. What are Gedilim? Lavan. Because it says, however, in Sefer B'midbar, you have to put on a Patil Techelet, you have to put on a Patil Techelet. And now it's probably Kedai here to mention that there's a big machlokus about the word when Chazal say Levan. Does Levan mean white, which is the literal meaning of the word white, or does Levan mean basically whatever? And here is a reason to think that basically Levan means kind of whatever, because I don't know how you'd get from the words Gedilim to mean they have to be white, Dafka. But Gedilim means you take strings, i.e. not particularly special strings, i.e. not Techelet strings, and you tie them together to make a Gedil, and then you have to put, and then the other pasuk comes to tell you how to put them Techelet. And this is an example of the importance when learning Sifrei Chazal to understand that there's a difference between a kind of semantic philology and technical uses of terms. Obviously, the word Levan means white. No one's disputing that the word Levan means white, right? But when you want to understand the Chazalic text, you need to understand that they use words in a conventional sense. They were quite averse, actually, to just sort of relatively averse, should we say, to just inventing words. They tend to borrow words and then apply them to different situations, often from concrete abstract situations. And you can't get too het up. You can't get too obsessed of the actual meaning, the actual of understanding. Well, if they use this word, what they must have meant something by using this word. They had their kind of conventional terminology. And what establishes the meaning of the conventional terminology is kind of everyone agrees to use it in the same way. And it's always, and when it's used in the same way, everyone understands and they don't get confused by it. And that's something to bear in mind when looking at all sorts of sources. Is don't try and build a big argument if the basis of your argument is that a word used here, its original semantic meaning is something else. Okay. Ta'aseh, you shall make. Velo min ha'asui, not from min asui. So we also saw this in Sifrei Zutta. That Tzitzit can't be from min asui. What does min asui mean? There in Sifrei Zutta it didn't really explain. Here it does explain. Shelo yosinimin min atalit v'yaseh. What you're not supposed to do, you're not supposed to leave. You can't make a garment and then you just didn't weave some of the threads, so they're just coming out. And now you take those threads, you make a good deal, you leave some of them hanging out, and they got Tzitzit. Boom, perfect, right? Wrong. Make your garment, make a hole in a garment, or don't even make a hole in a garment, just sew. But you have to sew or push through some new threads. That's the concept of ta'aseh v'lo min asui. There are also other ramifications of the principle of ta'aseh v'lo min asui. So, if your sort of garment, let's say you fold over your garment and sew it up, so now it doesn't have. You sew over one corner, so now it doesn't have four corners. It has 1, 2, 3, and then a kind of double corner here. And therefore, it's not Hive and Tzitzit. But it'd be perfectly possible for you to put Tzitzit in and then unsew it, and then now boom, you've got Tzitzit. That's no good because you have to have you have to make Tzitzit on a four-cornered garment. That's the principle of Ta'aseh v'lo min asui. Al arba. It says al arba v'lo al shmona, and not on 8. Well, we just saw already, not on 5, not on 6, not on 7, not on 8. So what does it mean? What does it mean not? What does it mean not on 8? Well, we actually saw again in Sifrei that a certain, if you put your Tzitzit right on the corner, that is considered to be, as if you put it, that is considered to be forbidden. That's to put a mamash on the corner of the garment. That is not considered to be valid. And the drosha there said, because it says alaba v'lo shmona. Now, I said over there, it's not entirely clear to me why that would be considered shmona, but it seems to be because if you have a corner and you put your Tzitzit right there on the corner, it's now dividing that corner into 2 corners. So if you had 4, now you have 8. In any case, the reference to v'lo shmona would appear to be a reference to that. Pesutcha, your garment. Prat le tager ula tivlatirim, ula pakrikim, la bursim, ula burdasim. This comes to exclude. This is the kind of characteristic drasha style of the school of Rabbi Akiva. You have a word and you say it comes to exclude, and it comes to exclude a whole bunch of stuff. What are these things? I actually looked this up in Jastro. I could only find 2 out of the whole list in Jastro, but it doesn't really matter because the Sifrei explains itself what these are. What's the problem? Because they're not square or they're not oblique. Talit, we know we put tzitzit on a cloak, basically a talit. Okay? And we know that cloaks can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. They can be oval, they can be kind of triangular. They can be narrow on one side and wide on one side. And presumably they had all sorts of different cloaks. And because they were much more into wearing cloaks in those days than we are today, because if you read a Doris, many of them weren't square or oblong. And the Sifrei says, well, these things are not square or oblong, are no good. And we learn that from the word kasut. Or more accurately, we have a drasha that helps us remember this rule of things that are not meruba'im are not Hive and Tzitzit, which is attached to the word kasutcha. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer minayin shelo yiten al emsa beged ela sifto tamud lama al arba kanfot. How do you know you're not just supposed to put the tzitzit somewhere in the middle of the garment? We've already said Lechora, the Sifrei was maramas to the concept you're not supposed to put it mamash right in the corner. Well, how do you know you're not supposed to go to the other extreme? You're not supposed to put it in the middle. Well, it said, told you, alaba kanfot kasut. Okay, that's clear enough. So not mamash in the corner, not as we also saw in Sifrei, not mamash on the edge, but also not in the middle of the garment, somewhere in the kind of kanaf, in the corner region. And as we're going to see, the Gemara and therefore the halacha defines exactly how do we avoid it being considered emsa and how do we avoid it being considered on the corner. Kasutcha prat lekar, kasutcha prat lesadin, techase prat lesagus, ba prat lema'aforot shelo techase rosh haruba. So we have a continuation of this prat methodology. So it comes to exclude a car. A car is a kind of cushion, basically, but a cushion that kind of, I think, was made by kind of folding over like various layers of cloth and then sewing it together. So it's kind of similar-ish to a beged. It says kasutcha, so that's not Hive and Tzitzit. Kasutcha prat lesadin. Sadin is sheets that you lie on. No, they're also not Hive because that's not a kasut. As opposed, of course, to a kasut laila, which we learn, although it's not brought up in Sifrei, but we saw both in Sifrei on Bamidbar and Sifrei Zutta on Bamidbar. We saw the drasha of U'itha Motor, because of course it says U'itha Motor in Bamidbar, it doesn't say U'itha Motor here, to exclude the kasut laila. Tishase, cover yourself with pras lesagus. I've forgotten what that is. I'm going to have to look it up, and I'll mention it at the beginning of next year. Blinei Deim Hashem, what exactly a sagus is, but that's also not Hive. And ba, the actual word ba, prat lema'aforet shelo techase rosh haruba. And as we've seen before, something that doesn't cover rosh haruba is also not Hive. Now, this is somewhat important. Again, we don't really know what a ma'aforet is. A lot of these words are unclear. But everyone knows, or everyone who's into this topic knows that the sugya is a rosh haruba shel katan. Okay, so the minimum size of a talit is that a katan can wear it rosh haruba and you can go out with it into the shuk. And that's as I was makabel. That's roughly 60 by 120 centimeters. And therefore, when we wear a talit katan, when people wear a talit katan, including myself, what are we really doing? We're taking a child's cloak that's Hive and Tzitzit because it's big enough for a child. We're sticking a hole in the middle and we're turning it into sort of poncho. However, do bear in mind that the Sifrei here says, Prat lema'aforet. Why is a ma'aforet not Hive? Shelo techase rosh v'ruba. It doesn't cover his head and his body. It's not big enough. Well, wait a second. What if it's not big enough to cover him, but it's big enough to cover a child? Well, the Sifrei doesn't say. But l'chora, it doesn't help. And you can learn this in different ways, and we'll see when we look at the Gemara, perhaps which is most plausible. One is, of course, the Sifrei and Gemara just disagree. Sifrei holds it has to be enough to cover your rosh and your rosh of Arubo, your head and the majority of your body. Whereas the Bavli holds, no, it doesn't have to be big enough for yours. It has to be big enough to cover a katans. And it's simply a machlokas still. Another way of looking at it is that the Bavli isn't telling you, okay, you want to wear tzitzit, but for some reason you don't like wearing a talis because you live in the 21st century and it would be very embarrassing for you to wear a talis and everyone would think you were weird. So I've got an eitzah for you. Take a child's talis, stick a hole in it and wear it as a poncho. Put a shirt on it, wear a jumper, whatever, and then boom, you're golden. You can be yotze in the midst of tzitzits without having to look like you're living in a different century. Maybe it's not saying that at all. Maybe it's just saying it has a garment to be chayav and tzitzit has to cover your rosh of Aruba. And children above a certain age are chayav, mishum chinuch, as we would generally say. Although, as we saw from Sifrei Zutta, didn't say that in as many words, certainly. Children are chayav, or you're chayav to mechanech them to wear tzitzit. And the question is, from when are they chayav to wear tzitzit? And the Gemara is telling you that a child of a certain age, once his garment is big enough to wear, you're chayav to put tzitzit in it. Whereas, say, a very small baby who can't go out in the shuk, even if he's wrapped up in some sort of kasut, as by the way, I think happens quite a lot. Probably less nowadays because we have, it's relatively cheap to buy clothes of like trousers and arms and stuff. But I assume back in the day it was very, very common just to like wrap a baby in a kind of sheet. I mean, swaddling bands and this kind of thing. Not chayav and tzitzit. The point is there's a minimum age at which a child's cloak becomes chayav and tzitzit, and that minimum age is not 3 or whatever is when people put on their tzitzit. Nowadays it's something a bit later. However, you as an actual adult, who are you trying to kid? You want to wear a talis, wear a talis. Why would you? It's true that a child's talis is chayav and tzitzit for a child, but it doesn't mean the child's tzitzit is chayav and talis. A child's talis is chayav and tzitzit for you. Those are the two possible ways of looking at the difference between the Sifrei and the Talmud Bavli. But it's just to emphasize here, the point is, this garment called a ma'aforet is excluded from tzitzit. Why? Because it doesn't cover rosh of Aruba, even though it very, very likely would cover the rosh of Aruba of a child. Because it doesn't cover your rosh of Aruba, that's what the Sifrei says, it's not chayav in tzitzit. Okay. All right. Let's review the important things, and then next week we're going to move on to the Talmud Bavli. There is also Sifrei Zutta on Devarim, but it's a bit harder to get your hands on. When I get my hands on it, I will do a share on that as well. But let's review the important things. First of all, there is a distinction between lilbosh, to wear something, and lehit kasot, to be covered with something. And therefore, we should bear that in mind when we'll see consistently, we never talk about wearing a talit. We always talk about being mitkaseh with a talit. And mitkaseh is not part of lilbosh, and that's something to bear in mind when looking at sources that are going to come up in the future. Another point is that we have an explicit kind of drasha that tzitzit involve tzitzit necessarily involve, or at least under certain circumstances necessarily involve, doing something that would otherwise violate the mitzvah of the issa of shatnez, and that's going to come up a lot in the Gemara. We have a really good interpretation of the general concept of you have tzitzit and you have gedilim and you will have multiple strings. We have a different version of the machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel that we have in Sifrei Bamidbar. In both cases, Beit Hillel say you have to have 3 strings. In both cases, the source says that the halacha is like Beit Shammai, whereas in Sifrei Bamidbar it says 3 white, 1 blue. Here it says 4 blue, 4 white, 4 blue. We have another drasha that tells you Arba is davcha arba, not 3 and not 5, not any other number. We have a repetition of the drasha that was also brought in Sifrei Zutta of ta'asev lo min asui. And we have a long list of garments that are excluded from the mitzvah tzitzit, either because they're not square or oblong, or because they don't cover a sufficient portion of the body. And that's enough for now. Pick it up next time with the Bavli.